The Minotaur might be the most misunderstood monster in all of Greek myth. And in case you couldn't hear it, that monster was in air quotes. Some people might give that title to other monsters like Medusa or Cerberus, but not me. Minotaur. That's the hill I'm dying on. I am not just saying this to have a hot take though. Sure, the Minotaur might be a nightmarish hybrid of a man and a bull, but when you actually look at his life story from his perspective, you realize that while he was born different, he was made into a monster. And because of that, he's been misrepresented as a savage brute in every pop culture medium you can find, from Marvel Comics to tabletop games like Dungeons and Dragons to video games like God of War, and who can forget the Minotaur's iconic tighty-whities and Percy Jackson. I can't exactly critique them for those portrayals considering the original myths present the bull man the same way, but we can blame that on the unreliable narrators. As it turns out, Theseus's entire life story, and specifically his encounter with the Minotaur, might be Athenian propaganda, written with the intention of portraying him as the ideal masculine hero, and the Minoans as a bunch of bullfuckers. But we'll talk more about that as we get through the story. First though, if you consider yourself a mythology nerd and have always wanted to see the land where these stories take place with your own eyes, then you should know you can still join me on the Messed Up Origins field trip to Greece this May. Appropriately, we're going to the Isle of Crete, the Minotaur's old stomping ground, and we're gonna see the ruins of King Minos' palace, bask in Apollo's light on the sandy beaches, and we'll have trained guides leading us through the museums full of ancient artifacts, filling us in on all kinds of history. The deadline to commit is February 16th, but if that price tag is a little too much for you to drop at once, remember there are payment plans that give you plenty of breathing room. I cannot express enough how great of a time that we have on these field trips. In fact, there are 4 people going to Crete that are joining for the 3rd time, because they realize just how special and unique these experiences are. So if you want to join us for a once-in-a-lifetime experience, then hit the Trova Trip link in the video description and pinned comment. So I think the best way to start this Minotaur breakdown is by addressing the most common misconception I've seen regarding Minotaurs: that there's more than one. Contrary to popular belief, the Minotaur is not an entire race of creatures in the same way that centaurs are. In case you forgot, the first generation of centaurs was the byproduct of a human hunchback named Centaurus banging a bunch of horses in the mountains without protection. And while the Minotaur has a similar origin story, he is one of one. Now, to be fair, most of the examples I can think of where there's more than one Minotaur are video games and card games, where liberties kinda have to be taken with the mythos so you have enemies to fight. And these representations usually make a point to put a creative spin on specific details, like how in D&D they live in labyrinths and are constantly on the hunt for man flesh. So I'm not saying this is a bad thing, but rather it's an example of how modern media subtly influences our ideas about these ancient myths, continuing their evolution to the point where we don't think twice about certain details that ancient peoples never even considered. With that in mind, there are a few adaptations that put their own unique twist on his story. I like his design in Hades in particular. He's far less a savage brute and more of an arrogant warrior who speaks surprisingly articulately, although he'd clearly rather communicate through his actions. Chaos is another one that portrays him in a way that I've never seen before, but more on that one later. First, we gotta talk about how a human-animal hybrid like this could come to exist in the first place. And to those who haven't heard this story before, it's precisely what you're hoping it's not. So let me introduce you to Minos, the wannabe king of Crete, who's a real piece of work, let me tell you. Minos was the son of Zeus and Europa, a Phoenician princess who Zeus whisked off her feet while he was in the shape of a bull, foreshadowing how significant a role the bull would play in her family's life. After Zeus impregnated Europa with triplets, she went on to marry Asterion, the king of Crete, and it was in Crete that she'd raise her 3 sons: Minos, Rhadamanthus, and Sarpedon. When Asterion up and died, it was time for his adopted sons to step up to the throne. All of them wanted it, but Minos wanted to be king more than anyone, even Simba, and he sang a whole song about it. But I guess Minos was not as talented of a lyricist because he resorted to good old-fashioned praying instead.
Boring!
I know it doesn't sound very exciting, but Minos is about to prove just how good of a bullshitter he is. Because while basically no one in Crete agreed that he should be king, he told them that it was ordained by the gods, and he said that to prove it, whatever he prayed for would come true. So Minos made a sacrifice to Poseidon in front of all the Cretan citizens and requested the god of the sea send a great white bull out of his domain. Then, under his breath, he promised to sacrifice the bull if Poseidon delivered. And evidently, Poseidon thought that was a fair deal, because only moments after Minos power-pointed to the Mediterranean, a big, beautiful beefcake emerged from the ocean, aura-farming every step of the way to Minos, and the crowd that was now chanting his name. Alright, the writers don't actually say they were chanting his name, but come on. If you saw a guy point to the ocean and a fucking bull rose from the watery depths, you better be chanting. Now, if Minos had sacrificed that bull right then and there, then his time as king would be remembered very differently. Instead, he chose to keep it for himself, and then sacrifice a couple of his best bulls as compensation. But in the eyes of a god, a deal is a deal, so as much as Minos wanted that bull, his wife was about to want it even more. Now, I didn't know this until researching for this episode, but there is actually an alternate version of the preceding events where Minos isn't quite as much of a snake. In another rendition, Minos is already king, and the bull sacrifice is actually a tradition in Crete where every year they sacrifice their best bull to Poseidon. But one year, Minos had a particularly beefy bull that he was too proud to sacrifice, and when he gave up his second best, Poseidon got pissed. That one is found in Diodorus Siculus's Library of History. Either way, the end result is the same. Poseidon curses the great white bull with an unrelenting madness that made it too dangerous to keep contained, so they had to set it free, and it continued to wreak havoc across Crete until Heracles came along and captured it for his 7th labor. But that alone wouldn't teach Minos a damn thing, and the god knew it. So on top of that, he cursed the completely innocent Queen Pasiphae to want to make sweet love to the great white bull.
Oh! Ew! Dude! What the fuck?
Yeah, the gods have a sick sense of humor. I'm also curious if he had to enlist Aphrodite's help for that one. None of the writers mention it, but that does seem like it'd be a job for either her or Cupid, who are both always game for some petty vengeance. Anyway, just like the bull, Pasiphae's passion could not be contained. She just had to find a way to bang this thing, and could think of no better person to help than Daedalus, the greatest inventor in all of Greece, who I'm sure had nothing better to do. Now, Daedalus, not wanting to kink-shame the queen, accepted the deal and put his great mind to work building a cow suit for her to have sex in. Wait, does that make Pasiphae the world's first furry? Doesn't matter. The final product was impressive though. So Pasiphae climbed into the wooden cow on wheels and had her servants roll her out to the meadow where the bull normally grazed. Then, after a time, the bull approached her and banged her just like it would a real cow, because it thought she was one. Then, an undisclosed amount of time later, their child was born. Which I know isn't shocking since this is a video about the Minotaur, but if you didn't know that's where this was headed, it's pretty crazy, right? Anyway, when the Minotaur was born, everybody was horrified. This thing was like 80% human, but its head looked like a bull's. Although fortunately for Pasiphae, its horns hadn't grown out yet. This is another change that pop culture has made to the Minotaur. More often than not, he and any other Minotaurs are depicted with bovine legs, but the ancient myths never actually describe him that way. Well, Pasiphae named her little monster man after her father, either Asterius or Asterion, depending on the version, which translates to the Starry One. But as far as I can tell, that is the only motherly thing that she did for him. Pretty much immediately after he was born, King Minos told Daedalus to build a labyrinth to imprison the crime against nature that was born from his blasphemy. Now, Daedalus could build just about anything, so he was up for the challenge, not that he had a choice. You know what he couldn't build, though? A website, but he could have if he had our sponsor, Squarespace. For years now, I've talked about Squarespace's giant selection of website templates, and how their Fluid engine makes designing a site ridiculously easy by letting you drag and drop elements wherever you want. But their latest flex is Design Intelligence. All you have to do is tell it what kind of website you want to launch and the vibe you're after, and Design Intelligence will build the site for you with everything you need. That could be a blog to share your thoughts, a place to host your music, a booking calendar for clients, or a storefront to sell merch. Squarespace keeps the whole process simple and stress-free, which is exactly why I use them for messeduporigins.com. If you want to try Squarespace yourself, head to squarespace.com/Jon Solo or hit the link in the description to start a free trial. Then when you realize you love it, use code Jon Solo at checkout to get 10% off. Naturally, designing and constructing a labyrinth was going to take some time, but curiously, we're never told exactly how long or what Asterion was doing during the construction. All we know is that as soon as it was built, the mini Minotaur was locked inside of it, all alone. The Roman poet Ovid described his new home as having blind walls of intricate complexity, a mazy multitude of winding ways, countless corridors so confusing that Daedalus himself barely made it out. Pseudo-Apollodorus calls it a cage with convoluted flexions that disorders debauchement. In other words, a terrible environment for a developing brain like Asterion's. Just imagine how terrifying his childhood must have been, growing up in a literal maze with little to no light and no human contact. When it comes to sustenance, I couldn't find what he ate on a day-to-day basis, but Pseudo-Hyginus tells us that every year he'd get a special treat: 14 Athenian children. 7 boys and 7 girls. Ovid says it was every 9 years though, so split the difference. How did this arrangement come to be, you might ask? Well, there are like 9 different versions, but they all boil down to Minos blaming Athens for the death of his son Androgeus, who, in most versions, was trampled by the Marathonian bull and gored to death. Only here's the kicker: the Marathonian bull was just the Cretan bull after it got away from King Eurystheus. So the very creature that Minos prayed into existence has now banged his wife and killed his son. But do you think he took any responsibility for that? Of course not. Instead, he loaded up his giant naval fleet and waged war on Athens until they agreed to sacrifice 14 children to be the Minotaur's midnight snacks. I'm not sure if they were all sent into his lair at once or spread out throughout the year, but I can tell you that for 27 years, no one survived the Minotaur's labyrinth. It's interesting how, because Minos didn't want to sacrifice the bull to the gods, now he has to sacrifice children to its offspring. I mean, that's not really a loss for him, but I do think it's a lesson to us to not betray the gods, because when our day of reckoning comes, we probably won't have the resources to ship in a dozen Athenian children. Maybe you do, but I certainly don't. Anyway, almost 3 decades after the deal with Athens was made, they were finally sick of it, and one day someone asked out loud, "Hey, how about we not sacrifice our kids this year?" Unfortunately, that wasn't an option, but the one and only Theseus happened to be nearby, and his ears perked up at this. What if, he thought, what if I volunteered as a sacrifice and kicked the Minotaur's ass? So Theseus sailed to Crete, wishing to either absolve Athens of their debt or die trying. So, when Theseus lands in Crete, Princess Ariadne happened to be watching the new lot of sacrifices coming in, and as the hero stepped off the boat, Ariadne was struck by Cupid's arrow. Probably literally. She knew this guy wasn't like the rest of the sacrifices, because he was like 30 years old, but he was more of a grade A beefcake than the Minotaur, and all she wanted was to taste that juicy sirloin. I think the sirloin is like the lower back of the cow, but it sounds kind of dirty, so that's what I went with. You don't want to know where Angus burgers come from. So when Ariadne met Theseus face to face and he told her why he was there, she vowed to do whatever it took to help him, as long as he took her with him afterwards. Then she went to Daedalus, the designer of the Labyrinth, to ask him how to navigate the maze. Remember, Daedalus barely made it out of there himself, but since then he'd found a solution. He gave Ariadne a ball of string and told her that if Theseus tied it to the entrance, he could retrace his steps after the deed is done and escape. So that's what Theseus did. And the stories differ about how well equipped he was when he went in there. Canonically, it makes the most sense for him to have no armor or weapons since he's just meant to be a sacrifice. But it seems like when the story was portrayed in a visual medium like a mosaic or on a vase, artists would take liberties and give Theseus a sword or a club, probably because it looked cooler. There were some that showed him barehanded though, which implies he would have won by beatdown or strangulation, which is actually how Perseus defeats the Minotaur in Wrath of the Titans. That movie is a mess, but pretty cool they incorporated that detail. I'm a little disappointed to share though, the written record doesn't give much of a description of their fight. Theseus finds the Minotaur in the deepest part of the labyrinth, and most of the writers just say he slew the Minotaur or he fought the Minotaur and won.
Boring!
The most detail we get is Pseudo-Apollodorus' Bibliotheca, which says he beat him to death with his fists. I feel bad because when I originally covered this story like 6 years ago, I said that Theseus cut the Minotaur's head off, but I think I was misled by a particularly creative, illustrative translation. Nowadays, I stick with the most literal translations, which can all be found on theoi.com. While as boring as some of those descriptions or lack thereof are, it's actually a pretty horrifying end if you once again consider the Minotaur's point of view. Thanks to modern media, we always imagine the Minotaur as this hulking figure, but he was just a guy born with an unfortunate congenital condition, and his execution was up close and personal, like a prisoner, a restrained animal that had to be put down. And while I don't want to spoil too much, Chaos also leans into this interpretation. In that show, the Minotaur is Ariadne's twin brother and wrongly punished for a prophecy that was misinterpreted. What I find really fascinating, and I think you will too, is that this interpretation isn't exactly new. It's kinda ancient. In Pausanias' description of Greece, he actually says that whether the Minotaur is an animal or man depends on who's telling the story. But even in his day, women give birth to more extraordinary monsters than this. In other words, whatever made the Minotaur so monstrous in reality would be considered tame 1,000 years later. Not exactly victimizing the Minotaur, but acknowledging that the legends about him were greatly exaggerated. As I mentioned earlier though, this was never the intended interpretation when the story was first told. We were not supposed to sympathize with the Minotaur, but rather be disgusted by him and laugh at the citizens of Crete. You see, bull symbolism and worship was a core component of Cretan culture. They were far from the only society to consider bovine sacred, but evidently they were obsessed, even by ancient standards. They sacrificed bulls to the gods on a regular basis. Bulls were a popular subject in their art. They held bull leaping contests where athletes would confront the chaos of the bull and conquer it without slaying it. And then there's the horns of consecration, stylized bull horns that were placed on palace roofs, in shrines, and hung on walls in much the same way that the cross is used in Christianity. So when you consider how bullish Minos' culture was, it starts to make sense that their archetypal king's life would be impacted so drastically by bulls, as opposed to any other animal. His mom fell for Zeus while he was in his bull form, and the bull that he failed to sacrifice would go on to kill his son and bang his wife. The Athenians are basically saying, those Cretans like cows so much that their queen fucked one and had a mutant baby with it. then our hero killed it. Once you strip away the propaganda though, what's left isn't a savage beast lurking in the dark waiting to eat your children. Astarion was a child himself, one that was abandoned in chaos, fed lies along with victims, and given no choice but to become a monster.